X Winterview. Here he is again, in the car. Where else? Driving on a fine sunny morning. Where is he going? To the beach. What's he gonna do? Run. But enough of me. I'm only a concept. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about science. From my dear friend Annastacey. You might hear the sounds of the rickety driveway in the background. Apologies in advance for the interference to the audio as I drive. I have a little bit to say on this. My qualifications in the matter are that I have a master's degree in science, and I work in science, so I feel like I'm allowed to say something on that subject. I have a license to expound my views. I often hear people refute the mystical or the mysterious, the esoteric, the occult, with the assertion that it's not scientific, and therefore does not exist. This is a gross misperception of the role of science, in my opinion. As far as I'm aware or concerned, science is a philosophy. And within the philosophy of science, there are methodologies that support the philosophy. There is not a singular philosophy of science. There is not one science. So first of all, even from the definitive standpoint, it's a bit uncertain about the status of science. I personally have always been a fan of Karl Popper's scientific, we'll call it principles or philosophy if you prefer, of falsifiability. And that is a way to generate forward momentum, never quite believing that you've landed on truth or fact, that everything is falsifiable, that there's always something more that you could learn or explore in depth. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of Popperianism at this point. Suffice to say, that's my personal leaning, my standpoint, my bias. The other thing to note in science is that we often use null hypothesis testing. What does that mean to the lay person? Basically, it means we never assert truth. We assert that we cannot defend a hypothesis. It's a very clever way of skirting around that very thorny issue of truth. This hypothesis turned out to be a load of crap. It's not a mistake. It's the way science works. We re-hypothesize, move forward, and experiment, and so on and so forth. The other thing that you might note in science is that you need to be able to clearly define stuff in order to measure it. And then, of course, the measurement itself. How do you measure the stuff that you've defined? And we look for relationships between the stuff that we have defined. We come up with more hypotheses. We try and invent laws if possible. Or at least we like high probability hypothesis. There's a good way of putting it. A lot of science is statistical probability, at least in the humanities. Not so much the hard sciences, perhaps, but I work in the soft sciences, you might say, where we come up with likelihoods and probability. So at least in the soft sciences, it's very hard to land on a definitive statement. We end up with statements like seems to be, appears to be, likely that, etc. We stay away from is and definitely and 100% guaranteed money back. We stay away from that statement quite a lot. The pursuit of science, therefore, requires definition, as I've just said, and a way to measure. and then we need intelligence to look at the relationships. But the definitions themselves are, wait for it, said it before, say it again, concepts, mental concepts. The world exists as a concept. So what we find with science is that we are measuring our concepts. Now, does this represent reality? Who knows? Does this represent truth? Who could say? Does it represent statistical likelihoods? Yes, I would go along with that one. So, at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, science is a way of creating models that explain phenomena that we can imagine or we can wonder about. We can't really measure what we don't know about. And in some way, hopefully expand knowledge, and even in some cases, are useful. I often hear that amateur scientists claiming that certain things aren't useful, and therefore not scientific. I'm afraid to say there's a whole branch of science devoted to knowledge, and is largely, well, they don't give a shit about utility. They just want knowledge. So utilitarianism is a sub-branch perhaps of science, maybe, I'm not sure, but it's certainly a philosophy. But it doesn't mean that something is or is not scientific just because it has a point or a purpose. The other thing to say about science is something called scientism. Scientism is a sort of recently invented jargon word, I guess, that somehow asserts that science will, that the understanding of science, singularly, if there is such a thing, will explain the mysteries of the universe, a kind of positivism in disguise. Positivism, if you're not sure what that is the more or less the belief that we can figure stuff out scientifically, find truth, and so forth. But we come back to this core point, that we don't know if science is measuring truth. We don't know, in fact, if it's measuring reality. We do know that we're measuring our concepts. We could say that with some degree of accuracy, but whether the concepts represent truth or reality, that's a leap into a different paradigm, a paradigm that's still hotly debated in philosophy. Is science going to save the world? I don't know, frankly. Does science disprove the unusual experiences, the unusual, mystical, esoteric, rare, statistically rare phenomena? No. Science cannot disprove in that way. We could say something along the lines of the statistical rarity of those experiences, well, make them rare and unusual. We could also say there's no way to measure them. But that's not the same as saying they don't exist. It's just saying we can't measure it. We could also say that the science that is already established, in some cases, doesn't suggest the likelihood of something being true. But again, that's a statistical statement. We're back to stats again. The probability of something being true or not. The other thing is, I think this is where the great confusion lies for scientivismists, is that they really think science is finding the truth. The truth is unknowable, unseen, a different paradigm, an entirely different domain, if it indeed exists. We are stuck in science with our concepts, and in some cases, science is so tediously slow because it, in some cases, refuses to go forward until a body of evidence exists that supports a hypothesis. Hypothesis leaping is not very popular in science. To jump ahead and have radical philosophies doesn't get you funding at universities. Universities like to plod along following a vein of research and, moreover, popular veins of research. Things that will get you money are usually in some ways politically motivated or of the times. You won't find the government throwing huge swaths of money at teams of researchers who want to choose something quite unusual and esoteric to study. So, for instance, we might have a mysterious energy manipulating medicine dude who comes down from the Himalayas and claims to be able to heal all manner of modern illnesses with special energetic movements of his hands. Now, this could happen. This could be an occurrence. We don't know. We couldn't say it's impossible. But to say that, wow, this is amazing, let's throw tons of money of research grants, etc., into this field, is just not going to happen. The reason is there's such a weight of scientific evidence on things that seem useful already, especially when it comes to healthcare, that you'll find that money would more likely go to, for example, cancer drug research or AIDS medication research or depression research and so forth, because these are very established in society, in culture, and have a massive volume of evidence of science behind them already. And that often gives the impression that they are somehow more valid or more real than things that aren't studied. The other thing about science, which is interesting, is that a lot of studies aren't actually published. There's a lot of research out there that is done, sometimes by students and sometimes by independents who aren't even in universities, that just simply won't see the light of day. And because it doesn't get the credibility of maybe some famous name researchers or big universities backing it, it simply doesn't have the status. So within science itself, there's a whole bunch of socio-political mechanisms that forward knowledge and get it out into the populace. So again, it's a mistake to say that in some cases there's no research that supports such and such a thing. In some cases you might find there is quite a lot of research hidden away somewhere, probably in Mum's basement, while the scientist languages upstairs playing his Xbox, wishing the world would pay attention. Where was I? So, is there a point to this? Is there a point to science? Is there a point to this subject, I meant to say? Should I bash science? Well, I'm only giving this brief dialogue because the subject matter that I often talk about to people is in some ways quite mystical. This is the experience of no self, which can represent a radically different perceptual shift in one's experience. The experience of being out of time, timelessness, which leads to spacelessness or infinity. These can't be talked about, they can't even be measured, but these are very real experiences. So from the point of view of the mystic, where time is perceived to be a concept, and in some cases it's an experiential reality that there is no time and no space, we realize suddenly that science falls into its own domain within the appearance of the world. It's domain specific. There are perhaps other domains of reality which are immeasurable. We've heard of in the esoteric circles of different realms, of different planes of existence that you couldn't measure. There's no way to get into those realms on purpose and measure them. You certainly can't trigger so-called mystical experience within the time-space realm. It doesn't work like that. It seems that might be the case, but it's putting the cart before the horse in some respects. So we know that science is contingent on the time-space plateau, which is an artifact of perception. We have to therefore understand as scientists that what we are measuring is one aspect, you could say, of reality, one aspect. And even the word reality is problematic. It gives the impression that science measures reality. You could say, in fact, that science is the scientific reality. That would be a fair comment, but that's not to say it's the single experiential sole reality of the world. The other thing to say on science is I'm talking about science from within that domain, so to speak, within that perception. If you were outside of time, if the time-space world had fallen away so completely, science appears as a phenomenon within the manifestation suddenly, a transient phenomenon at that. It arises, falls away. It arises and falls away. So even, for example, you have a calculator, you're doing maths, hard maths problems, you're writing it all down. That experience of doing all that is transient and ephemeral. It's there for one moment and then it's not there. So even taking a step back, you might say, a meta perspective, science is just yet another appearance within the entire world, within the universe, and so is in fact impermanent at the end of the day. And we know when we go to sleep at night, the world just falls away, and all the science and all those wonderful creations of science fall away too, and which is very interesting, because to me that suggests that reality is just like a dream. And you can dream of doing science when you fall asleep at night, an unfortunate and boring dream perhaps, but there you are doing scientific equations in your sleeping dream. Then you wake up and all that research has gone, it's all fallen away, and now you're back into the so-called daytime reality, and now you're doing something else. Maybe you're doing science again, maybe you're going water skiing, maybe you're in a cafe drinking a coffee. The world and the appearance comes and goes, irrespective of whether you're asleep or whether you're awake. And that suggests that this so-called permanent, fixed reality is highly conceptual. Highly conceptual. So this is the end of the dialogue really, but I just wanted to flag the caution, if you like, about claiming that science measures reality and the refuting unusual or statistically rare states of consciousness or awareness as bogus just because we can't measure them. This has been X Winterview, the brief dialogue. Comments are welcome.